Hi, I'm Greg Pollock, and this is Advanced Components here at Vue Mastery. In this lesson, we'll be looking for reactivity in the Vue.js source code. Our objective here is to get comfortable parsing through the Vue.js source code. We'll learn some Vue.js design patterns and architecture, which will make it easy as you read the source code and as you debug your own applications. Also, we'll be learning some caveats to the reactivity system that you'll want to look out for. If we look into the Vue component documentation, we'll see in the data property that Vue will recursively convert its properties into getters and setters and make it reactive. If you watched the lesson before this, that'll make sense because we created our own getters and setters in our reactivity system. To start parsing through the Vue.js source code, we want to start with a simple component. So here you can see we have a div that prints out product. Inside of our script tag, we'll create a new Vue instance, bind it to our app div, and have some data, which is simply product socks. Our quest in this lesson is to find where in the Vue.js source code product becomes reactive. Let's see if we can find it. We'll start tracing by looking at the definition of this Vue class that we're creating a new instance of. So let's move that up to the top of the page. And we can find this code inside source core instance index.js. This file includes a lot of import statements. And here is our Vue class. I'm not going to make you read through all the Vue.js source code. Along the way, I'll be omitting some stuff to make it more readable, in which case I'll be using a lot of those dots like you see here. This function simply calls underscore init, and it looks like it initializes a bunch of mixins having to do with state, events, lifecycle, and render. The next step in our call stack is that underscore init method. We'll find that in init.js inside init mixin. This function creates our VM constant, sets underscore self, initializes lifecycle, events, render. Oh look, there's a call hook before create, and then init injections. This might look familiar because if we look in the documentation, we see this diagram. Oh look, init events and lifecycle. That's where this is happening. Then we have before create. Notice that little hook on call hook there? From now on, whenever there's a call hook, I'm going to be using that little hook icon. And then we have init state. Then we have init provide and another call hook. And then mount. We're interested in tracing into the init state function. Let's dive in there next. We find init state inside state.js. Inside here, we initialize our watcher array, go through all of our options, initialize props, initialize methods, check to see if we have a data option, and we do, so we're going to call init data. Otherwise, we just call observe. It looks like we initialize our computed options and see if we have any watch options as well. Let's dive into init data. That's where we go next. This is also inside state.js. Here we set our data options. In case you're wondering, right now that's product socks. In case you're wondering, to trace down through this call stack, I just used Chrome DevTools. I set a breakpoint and I went through things step by step by step. This allowed me to look at the data variable like you see here so I could look at the values. Next, we're going to jump into that observe method. Inside observe, we do a few things and then call new observer with our current value and then return that. Take a mental snapshot here because we're going to jump into the observer class. Inside the observer class, we have a constructor where we set the value. We check to see if it's an array. If it is an array, we call observe array, which will go through each item in that array and call observe on it, which of course goes back up to our observe function. However, our value is not an array, so we're just going to call walk with this value. The walk function gets the keys from our object, just like we did in the previous lesson, goes through each of them and calls define reactive. We must be getting close here. Are you excited? I'm excited. What does define reactive do? Well, it looks like it has a bunch of parameters. Here's the values in case you're wondering. Key is product, value is socks, and that val is going to be our internal value. Remember that from the first lesson? Then we create a new dep class. Remember, that's where our storage lies. And we call getOwnPropertyDescriptor in case it already has one. Also, we check to see if it's not configurable. Then return, we can't add reactivity. We're going to fetch any predefined getters and setters. Then we're going to call defineProperty. Remember this? I bet this is where it's going to define our getters and setters. Let's take a look inside there. We have some configuration, and then look, there's our get function. First, we check to see if we've got a custom getter, otherwise use the internal value. Then, if we have a target, call dep_depend, remember that? And lastly, return our value. Next, we define our set function. Inside that, we'll call a custom getter if we have it, otherwise just set our value. If our new value is the same as the old value, we don't need to do anything, so let's just return. If it has a custom setter, call that, otherwise set our internal value to the new value. And then lastly, call dep_notify to rerun any of our subscribers. Awesome. Now let's walk through our entire call stack, starting with our observer. So here's what happened in the observer to get reactivity. Behind that was init state. Before that was _init. Before that was our view function. And this all started from creating our new view instance. And there you have it, the call stack for creating reactivity in Vue. Remember our watch function from the first lesson? It looks something like this. And it was defined like this, where we set the target, ran the target, and then unset the target. Well, Vue has a watcher class that's a bit more complex. It does a bunch of things. It receives as a parameter the code to watch, just like our watch function. It stores the code inside a getter property. It has a get function, which is called in instantiation or by the scheduler, which runs push target, right, to set the dep.target for this watcher object, to set the target. It calls this.getter.call to run the code. It runs pop target to remove the current dep.target. And it also has an update function to queue this watcher to run using a scheduler. So let's get familiar with this code inside the Vue source. Here we are inside watcher.js. Inside of it, we have our get method. This is called from the constructor. And inside, we push the target, we call our getter, then we pop the target and return the value. Inside of our update method, if it's lazy, we set dirty. Otherwise, if sync is true, we just run it. Otherwise, we queue this watcher to run. This is called from notify, when we need to rerun our dependencies. In case you're wondering what run does, it checks to see if it's active. If it's active, then it runs this. The queueWatcher function, when it's ready to execute, also will call the run method, which of course calls get as well. I know this is a little bit confusing, but I thought it was important to let you guys know what the Watcher class looks like in case you ever go parsing through the source. Let's move this over to the side and take a look at Vue's dep class. If we look inside our dep class, we can see its subscriptions. It's just called subs. It's an array, and each item is of type Watcher. Interesting. Inside of our dep method, we check to see if we have a target. If we do, we call add dep. Interesting. The add dep method, in case you're wondering, pushes the current dependency onto our new deps method. See, in Vue, the Watcher class also keeps track of dependencies. Then it calls the add sub method, which is inside of our dep class, and simply adds this Watcher onto the subs array. Inside of our notify method, we go through each of the subscriptions and we simply call update. That's going to either cue the watcher to get run or immediately run it, as we saw a minute ago. All right, let's look back at this render diagram one more time. Remember, we have our getters and setters. That's using the object-defined property. When get is called, it's collected as a dependency, calling dep_depend on our dep class. When a set is called, it's going to be calling dep_notify, also on our dep class. We have our watcher class, which we just took a look at. And our watcher gets created inside Vue by running this line you see here. Our anonymous function is inside the update component parameter. That renders our component function and gets called every time a reactive property is set. There are two caveats you should be aware of to Vue's reactivity system. If you use any of these array mutation methods, don't worry, Vue wraps them properly so they trigger updates in the reactivity system. However, Vue can't detect the following change if you set an array like you see here. The solution to this is to write vue.set if you need to update a value. Also, if you need to change the length of an array and you use this syntax, it's not going to work with the reactivity system. Instead, you should use the splice method, like you see here. The second caveat is that Vue can't detect property addition or deletion. So if I have a component like this, and I set a new property, it's not going to be reactive. I can't add new root level reactive properties. The solution to this is a two-step process. First, you're going to want to nest your object inside of another object like you see here. And then if I want to create a new reactive property, I can use the VueSet method. And now there's a new reactive property called color. If I have multiple properties that I want to become reactive, I can use the object assign syntax, like you see here. Let's review what we learned in this lesson. First, we dove into the Vue source code and we started to get comfortable parsing through it. We learned some of the Vue design patterns that it uses for reactivity. Hopefully, this will improve your debugging skills if you ever need to debug into the same reactivity or rendering system. And lastly, we learned about two caveats we should be aware of in reactivity. Thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next lesson. And as an aside here, to trace down this call stack. And as an aside here, all I did was go into Chrome DevTools and just I then stepped in going step. That allowed me to look at the value of variables like data you see here so I could let you know what it is currently. But I'm actually pointing the wrong direction.